Thank you so much. I have a friend who is a big St. Louis Cardinal fan. And when the Cardinals were in the playoffs against the Mets a couple years ago, made the mistake of going to Shea Stadium in New York City wearing Cardinal jersey and hat. And I begged him not to do it. I said, it's not a good idea. And even worse, he took his daughter, 20-year-old woman, a huge Cardinal fan. I'm sure she was in her gear as well. And they're in the stands. Anybody ever been to Shea Stadium? Anybody been to Yankee Stadium? So as a Red Sox fan, I really think of this as a Yankee Stadium story. But, my integrity forces me to admit it took place in Shea Stadium. But it could have happened in Yankee Stadium. No problem. And so, people like to make fun of economists. I'll just say assume it was Yankee Stadium. So, so she's in the stands, and around her are some folks who evidently, who knew, have been drinking. And, but they could be sober. And they're telling her things. They're giving her advice. And she's increasingly uncomfortable. And she is getting a little bit scary. And she turns to one of New York's finest, a policeman in the aisle, and says, "Is it safe?" And he says, "Safe for me." It's the way my friend told it to me. It's a great New York story, isn't it? I mean, it's just phenomenal. I feel that story comes to mind when people ask me, "How's it going?" And I always say, "Good for me. Bad for the economy. It's a terrible time, but hey, I'm an economist. For some reason, it's a bit mysterious. We're in demand." I say mysterious because we didn't really predict this crisis. We're having a little disagreement on how to get out of it. One guy says we should spend $2 trillion. Another one says we should spend $0. They're both Nobel Prize winning equality economists. Isn't that a little bit embarrassing to my discipline? We should kind of be in the basement laying low for a couple of decades. But I guess if you're going to ask people for economics advice, better to ask an economist than an electrician. So we do get an incredible amount of attention these days. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about the mess we're in. And if we have time, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might want to ask about this or anything else that's going on. You probably saw the unemployment numbers came out this morning. Good news, unemployment's down to 10%. Still double digits, but there are signs of improvement. The overall economy seems to be doing well. But I would argue it's way too early to say that we're out of the woods. The Federal Reserve is sitting on $1 trillion of mortgages that it's buying from Fannie and Freddie. Kind of a little quiet thing going on in a corner. The Fed does not have mark-to-market accounting. So the actual value of those mortgages is not $1 trillion. The default rate on those is going to go very, very high. And this year and next, I'm very worried about that. Of course, I'm also worried about inflation. Banks are sitting on a lot of reserves that when things start to get better, they will start to lend out. The deficit this year is going to be 1.4, this past year was 1.4 trillion. We're going to try to roll over some short-term debt. They say we're going to have to borrow maybe $3 trillion. What if there aren't people who want to lend the United States $3 trillion? We could default. It's a ridiculous possibility. It would have been absurd to say anything about like that 5 years ago. The probability is not zero anymore. It's not very high, but it's not zero. More disturbing to me is how we have lost respect in our country for the rule of law. Washington is running industries, setting pay, bailing out people in an ad hoc, non-transparent way. It's bad for democracy and bad for capitalism. In the frantic fiddling that's going on to artificially prop up the auto industry, the housing market, and Wall Street, we're destroying the fundamental underlying principles that create our prosperity. We are what we do. We are what we do. Not what we say we are, not what we wish we were, but we are what we do. And what we do lately in the United States, unfortunately, is to prevent really rich people from facing the consequences of their actions if they work on Wall Street. Think about that for a minute. What we do in the United States in the last year and a half is to prevent Wall Street investors from paying the full consequences of their mistakes. That is destructive of capitalism. Capitalism is a profit and loss system. The profits encourage risk-taking. The losses encourage prudence. We have stripped away the loss part of that equation. And is it surprising that as a result we get more recklessness? That we get less prudence? In the financial sector, we have insulated people who made mistakes from the consequences of their actions. We have done that in a very subtle way. We don't always bail out companies that make bad decisions. We do something actually that's worse. We bail out the people who lend them money. We rescue creditors to risk-taking institutions and make them whole. You may have seen recently that in the AIG bailout, $180 billion, that money, of course, didn't really go to AIG. It went to AIG's creditors. Goldman Sachs being the number 2 on the list, $14 billion. Did you see this? How many people saw that story or read the recent audit of that experience? Anybody see that? It's a useful thing to look at. There were about 7 major people at AIG who were AIG owed money to who were going to get this money. In the summer, before the bailout, AIG was negotiating with these folks, trying to say, maybe you'll take less money, 60 cents on the dollar, because we're in trouble. The government comes and takes them over. Tim Geithner, at the time, the president of the New York Fed, is now in charge of AIG, and he decides to give 100 cents on the dollar instead of the 60 cents that had been perhaps a negotiation before. One creditor, Union Bank of Switzerland, offered to take a discount voluntarily. You know what discount they offered? 98 cents on the dollar. 99 would be a little gauche. That would be like in your face. That's like a fake discount. But 98, that's 98. But the other creditors, they said we'll only do it if everybody agrees. They didn't agree. They didn't agree. They all got 100 cents on the dollar. Now, if you tell creditors, lenders, that you don't have to worry about losing your money, which is what we implicitly told people who lent Fannie and Freddie money to buy mortgages, and what we told people on Wall Street, or what they came to believe, that they would probably be bailed out, and most of them were, well, it's not surprising that people take large risks. The mess we are in financially was caused by people gambling with other people's money. The homeowner who bought a house with 3%